Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast, and we are glad to have you with us. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm sitting in my studio today and looking out on kind of a gray day, but I'm glad to be home because I was just at the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, General Assembly. And anyway, got in late last night, and if I sound like my mental faculties are not fully operational, that may be because they're not. But so
the General
anyway,
Assembly can do that to you.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll have a few things maybe to say about the General Assembly, but I want to say this. I probably saw 20 people who listen to the podcast on a regular basis. They came up and said hello and thanked us for the show, and it was really, really marvelous. And so anyway, thanks a lot to all the folks who were there in St. Louis who came and spoke to me about the show. I appreciate you reaching out. Anyway, enough about me for now. Glenn, why don't you take it away?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University, and still not tired of saying that. I am also a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I've got a ministry called Every Spur Inch Ministries that I run as well.
Good stuff. Tom?
Tom Price, teach systematic theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and other things at a variety of places, one of which is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I'm in the midst of some writing projects. More to come on that in due time.
Yeah, excellent. Speaking of writing projects, I know you have one you're working on, Glenn, or at least one. My Bombadil book is moving along nicely. I just saw the foreword that Brad Bierzer wrote, the historian from Hillsdale College, who wrote his own book on Tolkien and has a book coming out on the Inklings. But anyway, it was a marvelous foreword, and I'm very pleased and I'm very grateful to Brad for doing that.
Did you ever get permission to use the title you wanted?
Well, my understanding is they're just going to roll ahead with it and just whatever happens. It was their call at the publisher, so I'm good with it. In fact, that's what I was hoping they'd do. But yeah, anyway, I think talking to the Tolkien estate is like speaking into like the void. There's probably a lot of things that they're involved with, and you're just one more thing. And so I think that what's going to happen is they're just going to publish it and hope for the best under that title. So the title is going to be In the House of Tom Bombadil. Anyway, speaking of books, it's my day today, and I've been asked to review a book for a new publication called The American Reformer, and I'm really pleased to have been asked to write for them. And they gave me a book to review for my first column there. I think I'm going to be a regular with them. But the book is entitled The Recovery of Family Life by Scott Yenor. And the subtitle is fascinating. It's Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies. So Yenor is a professor of political science at Boise State. And he had an earlier book on family, but this one has made quite a splash, and I've seen him pop up now in different places. He had a piece in the online edition. I think it was just on the online edition over at First Things, and he had another piece over at The American Mind, which are both great places to be published. And anyway, I think he's been more or less vetted as kind of a new sort of authority on the recovery of family life. So anyway, I want to talk about this book. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about ideology and then get into the book and, quote, read a few things. And then, like I told you guys before the show, there's plenty to respond to. You won't have any difficulty thinking of things to say. But let me begin with the assessment of the book and more or less the assumption of behind the title. The title implies that family life is either under threat or it's been eclipsed or we've lost it. So we need to recover it. And he attributes the loss to obviously ideologies. And so, for example, here's a paragraph from the third chapter, and the title of the chapter is "Contemporary Liberalism and the Abolition of Marriage." Now, there you go. So here, now, sometimes I think that people out there in Peoria or Tubunk think that people like us who are conservatives, who are familiar with trends in the academy, are alarmist and overreacting. But actually, we're not. There's plenty of material that we can draw on to help illustrate the hostility that many of our colleagues in the academy feel toward things that most people think are great, and one of those things is marriage. So here's a quote. This is from, as I said, page 39. Feminists would abolish marriage and the family to create a world beyond gender. Contemporary liberals criticize marriage and family life in the name of moral neutrality, or a state that refrains from legislating morality, or more broadly, in the name of autonomy or choice. Feminists speak about an indefinite future and the independent woman, while contemporary liberals would secure autonomy and relational diversity. Contemporary liberals provide the justification for a complete independence for women and children from marriage. These different frameworks, while analytically separable, have become one, though in a tense amalgamation. So what he's saying is that there's a kind of mutual reinforcing relationship between these different ideologies. He just identifies two at this point: feminism and liberalism. But they're not entirely compatible. There is a kind of tense relationship between the two. We can talk a little bit about that. But anyway.
Yeah, Chris, one of the things that I think should also be noted here is the influence of the New Left on all of this. Because the New Left is one of the things that's influencing later waves of feminism. It also certainly influences LGBTQ stuff, and it is prominent in the academy and in liberal politics. The New Left argued that they combined sort of Marx filtered through Gramsci with Freud. And so you get this kind of Freudian Marxism that says that in order to reach the promised land, the coming perfect utopia, you have to break down all of the institutions that support bourgeois society, because all those institutions do is exist to preserve the status quo. And the foundation of all that is family. So they very self-consciously said, we really need to take out the nuclear family.
Yeah, that's exactly.
I think that's underlying both of these trends that you see here.
Right. That comes through very strongly in another place that Yenor addresses, and that's Herewith Firestone's Dialectic of Sex: The Case for Feminist Revolution, which was published in 1970, which, by the way, is right about the time the New Left really came onto the scene very strongly.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was there are just a number of things I could read here that just are just mind-blowing in terms of the the insouciance with regard to the casual dismissal of so many things that we've relied on forever. Motherhood, men taking an interest in their children and providing for them, all those things that we think of as being necessary for a healthy society. But in the end, what she's actually calling for is something that's very much in keeping with the transhumanist project. In other words, what you have is an approach toward the physical world which takes nothing as given and perceives the natural world and its structures as just simply, so much material that we can work on and rearrange and change to suit our own fancies. Anyway, if folks are interested in seeing these quotations which make your hair stand up, you can just look at the first chapter on feminism and the abolition of gender. But anyway, so yeah, I think all that stuff is good to keep in mind. What I want to do, though, is I want to jump to the subtitle, because I think the subtitle is really remarkably important. So the first part of the book, Yenor essentially, surveys the lay of the land. He says, this is what feminism, liberalism, and the sexual revolution have been up to. And so there's a lot of stuff that I think folks out there in Pugcast land would be familiar with in terms of, stuff that they see in the news, but they won't be familiar with, sort of the roots of this stuff and just how forthright these people are in terms of their agenda and how radical they are. By the way, the word radical comes from the Latin, which means to go to the root. So radicals really do go to the root of things, and in what we're talking about here is an approach that takes nothing for granted, that takes any sort of resistance or defeat or failure to bring about the kind of the world that they would like to see brought into being, not as some lesson to be learned about what's possible and what's not, but more or less a demonstration that these vile and evil structures are even more deeply rooted in our psyches than we thought before. And instead of learning anything, they just double down. They just work harder. They get more radical and try to get at your kids earlier. So I don't know. They already have access to your kids in nursery school. Maybe they want to get access to your kids just in the womb. I don't know, but I think that that's important to kind of have in the background as we think about this. But ideology, let's talk a little bit about that. What is an ideology? I think that's a lot of folks use the term ideology as a synonym for philosophy, and I think that is not the correct way to think about ideology. I do think that there are philosophies that lend themselves to sort of providing a fertile ground, within which or on which ideologies can grow. But there are philosophies that are anti-ideological as well. So I can see you guys are nodding. You probably have some thoughts on that. What do you have to contribute to that?
Well, I was thinking a recent work, and I don't have the author with me. That's why I'm bobbing my head around. I'm trying to find the actual book, but the title of the book is called Our Shadowed Present, and it was actually looking at the nature of historical, history and the historical in this kind of postmodern context. And it has a whole chapter on the making of ideology, and it kind of unpacks the relationship of the way oftentimes we even conceive the historical now as inseparable from the ideological. But I think, one of the things you get with ideology is the kind of lifting up out of reality into a kind of a detached ideal, not a realizable goal, but a detached ideal. And then that becomes oppressive on the whole, because it basically comes down and it's like a Procrustean bed, if you will, that forces all of reality to fit within its narrow interpretive parameters.
It might be good to give a little. It might be good to give a little definition of Procrustean bed. I know what it means. Glenn knows what it means, but tell us, Tom, what does it mean?
Well, Procrustes, if I could get it out, was known for what? Chopping off the limbs to fit them into the bed. Someone may, I don't recall all the details of the story. If any of you remember the details of it,
you had it right. Basically, I've got a bed that's only so big, and if you don't fit, we'll cut you down to size.
and he claimed the bed would fit anybody.
That's right.
And so if you were too big, you lost things, and if you were too small, he kind of pulled you apart,
stretched you out.
Yeah. So
this problem goes way back. This is not it's strictly a contemporary problem. People have been doing this sort of thing forever, but I do think that we live in a time where we're unable to philosophize in the ways that are, more akin to what people did in antiquity. And really, a lot of philosophy today is ideological in character. So I do think that the mistake of equating ideology with philosophy is understandable, because most contemporary philosophers are ideologues. But there is a way of thinking about reality that doesn't lend itself to ideology, and it begins with what is what you could call nature. What have we been given? What is natural, and working within the framework of nature. Now that is something that ideologues, just I don't know, it makes their hair stand on end when a guy like me says something like that. They'll say, "You're an essentialist," and I'll say, "Yeah, I am." But maybe we can comb that out a little bit.
Well, that's really where the big break goes, doesn't it? Eventually, I mean, all the way back 13th, 14th century, when you're basically moving away from that there are essential natures that have distinct, characteristics and functions and goals, to a loosening of that, and then everything automatically starts to become functional. And so, I mean, even in theology, it's all about God pro me. What theology helps me achieve social justice, right? So theology isn't about God and all things in relation to God, ordered the right way and our loves the right way. It becomes a ideological project for constructing a view of reality and God all the way down to achieve this particular ideological aim. And so this does infect everything. And we see as history starts to become conceived differently, or let me think of it here. This is an easy way to break it down. Two big threads running through to the present moment, probably breaks from 13th, 14th century on. One is naturalism, which basically you have a machine that has taken away all essences and natures from the world and basically made them functions for survival. And so you have this kind of development within combinations of a machine that's kind of interlocked and just it's pure nature like a clock, and it's just not organized by anyone, just chance, and it's just running, and everything that is a byproduct of that. Or you have the kind of organic type of picture in which everything is one big chain of becoming. And so, consciousness is kind of, the spirit realizing itself through time. And so you do have teleology. Do you have purposes? You have natures, but they're fluid. And they don't have any essences. They are only tied to what the combination of things you're related to at any given moment. Like think of the fruit in the organic garden, right? And so you have that, and then everything is in development towards some kind of fuller realization. And so you do have a teleological picture, and you do have things more than just functions, but they're so fluid that there isn't anything that's solid and a solid grasp. And so Marxism is a flip version of that. It's not heading towards a sort of spirit realizing itself, but sort of just a dynamic of nature reaching some kind of, I guess, stasis or some kind of something, equilibrium. And
I think equilibrium is a good way to put it.
Yeah, and so everyone at this point, I mean, Marx wanted to kind of get rid of ideology because he felt it lended towards that picture I mentioned just before, that there's some kind of spirit goal, consciousness, this kind of super consciousness that we're arriving at that's going to give some kind of meaning to the whole. And for him, it was just economic and social well-being. And that was kind of, for him, that was connected to nature enough.
Well, and too, he thought of ideas as essentially ephemera that just kind of floated on the kind of the substructure of economic forces. But at the same time,
which raises an interesting question. Where did his ideas come from?
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
They always transcend.
right. But this, there are I think a number of ways that we can kind of get to this, matter of ideology and how it functions in terms of its growth. But I do think we do find ourselves at a particular moment where it seems to be working more in a way that has it reflects in one sense a kind of Marxist way of thinking about the material world, but also a kind of Gnostic approach to reality, where our minds are sort of just floating, and our will. This is I guess Nietzsche would be the person to think about in this respect, which imposes form and structure on a essentially structureless reality. And one of the things I think that it would have been good in the book, Yenor's book, to do is I think he would have been. It would have been great if he would have provided a definition of ideology. Now, at the very end, he does get to in his final section, basically the assumption that's underlied the entire book. So let me just read this, and this is very much in keeping with what we've been talking about. So this, I think, is his understanding of ideology, even though he doesn't, front-load it. It comes at the end. He says, Francis Bacon or René Descartes were not thinking about modern feminism, sexual liberationism, and transgenderism at the birth of the modern. Yet the idea of human power and the idea of nature as there to be controlled through human action, stripped of qualifying moderation, eventuated in these late modern ideas. Nature, on the modern view, as it comes to us, does not lend direction to human will or human action. It is the stuff out of which human beings can make their future. And then he adds, no limits, kind of as a, sort of aside. So then he goes on to say feminists and their, he goes on to talk about, things that we've already talked about, how feminists strive to separate gender from sex and so forth. But I think that's, a pretty good way of thinking about how ideologies come into being. If this is simply a world that is matter in motion that surrounds us and has no sort of moral content, and this is, of course, a theme that we on the Pugcast have returned to again and again and again and again. Yeah. If that's the case, then philosophies of life, which would include feminism and so forth, strive to impose structure according to the wills of the people who do the philosophizing. And they're necessarily stupid then, because instead of learning from their engagement with the world as it is, they just simply double down, as I noted earlier, and work harder and try to do what they are up to in a more sort of, I guess, reckless and desperate way. And one of the ways he talks about this in the course of the book, and he's got a number of really helpful images that he introduces in the book, but one of those is something he refers to as the rolling revolution. So feminism, liberalism, the sexual revolution, they're all rolling revolutions, and almost Sisyphus-like. They never actually get to the goal because the goal is impossible to achieve. Yeah. And so things just keep rolling forward. And anyway, and so everything is qualified by not yet, we'll get there, we need to work harder, that kind of stuff. Anyway.
One of the interesting things about ideologues is they constantly accuse Christians of trying to impose their values on society and say you can't do that, but they seem to have no qualms about imposing their own. Yeah, they rather remind me of Winston Churchill's quote about fanatics. He says a fanatic is someone who can't change the subject who can't change his mind and won't change the subject.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Yeah, we have to remember that one. Yeah,
Yeah.
to that point, I think that sometimes Christians behave like ideologues. Do you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
almost as though they believe that the Bible imposes a structure on a meaningless world.
Yeah.
They seem to they seem to miss the Bible's own disclosure that the world itself has been made by God and comes front loaded with meaning, and
Yeah.
that the Bible is actually working with that meaning. It's and
Yeah.
helping us to see it maybe in deeper ways than we could otherwise.
That's right. I mean, I think that's one of the I always talk about the shift that happened somewhere in Western history where this conception of God basically as sheer will, imposing a will on a creation that otherwise is basically would kind of go its own direction out of its own will, and therefore you have this contest of wills. And so yes, Christianity in that context takes the Bible as sort of as a revelatory positivism where it is just asserting that kind of voluntaristic view of God is basically just imposing a will. And it's very different than the actual reality vision that Scripture itself sets forth. And when we start to read the kind of life givingness and the beauty and depth attached to that created order and its form, that the heavens declare the glory, and this is a much richer and enlivening picture, a beautiful picture to live in. And one of the things I noticed, you talk about the real rolling revolution, is really what starts back in the imagery of the garden, right? Where basically breaking into a relationship that God's good form ordained in that the creation of the world and the ordaining its natures and purposes. Once that becomes a friction for humans because of the fall, and they start to see that now not as something to accord with and flourish with, but now pain has entered into childbearing, and the consequences of sin have entered into these good forms. And rather than as Scripture says, conform to the good gift of the law, to which brings us back into accord with these forms so that we can flourish and be blessed, we rebel against them, but the law and them, and therefore we see them as something to be liberated from, not as where our beatitude lies. And this contrast, the psalmist who says, look, he meditates, he's blessed, he's flowing with life, and his family's flowing with life. He's like a tree planted by the river, and in God's law does he meditate both day and night, right? Compare that with the anger of the nations, right? So you really have these contrasting views, and this is just, it's not much different than what you see at every university and school now, just absolute rebellion against those basic forms. What's best for the family, married husband, one woman, one man, married for life, all this stuff. Now, what they do recognize, to their probably ignorance, is that those forms are imperfect, right? They are under the conditions of the fall, and yet that for them, the only solution is basically to be liberated from them. They are something that is repressive and holds us back from our own imposition of our will. And so what they do is they use the imperfection as an excuse to get rid of the whole thing. So, okay, because in patriarchy, somebody happened to abuse that role, therefore patriarchy itself is nothing but one big abusive role to be delivered from. And so you see this kind of endless battle and war against the fact that sin may exist in something, which they take. Think of it right now in Europe, European influenced cultures. Because people that happen to be of certain descent did things that were less than noble and sinful, therefore everyone has to be guilty of it if they have any association with it whatsoever. And so there happens to be a whole innocent group of people. They're the ones trying to be freed from that influence.
Yeah, I think that's a great subject for another show. I think that we should probably at some point address the practice of, of attributing guilt, to classes. I mean,
Yeah.
we've talked a little bit about
The
that before.
scapegoat, yeah.
Yeah. So related to this, Yenor is approaching, the subject of nature as a political scientist. I'm not a big fan of the term political science. I like the old political philosophy, better.
Yeah.
But anyway, he didn't invent his title. He was just put there, and he does, and he's clearly well read and familiar with the landscape of the world of philosophy. But in order to introduce a kind of a set of limits. And that's what we're getting at here. We're saying that the world comes preformed. There are certain things that are simply not subject to our, whims and programs, and therefore, let's, sort of identify these limits, and that's what the subtitle says: exposing the limits of modern ideologies. And one of the ways he does that is he talks about nature. Now, he's approaching nature not so much from a sort of Christian framework. He's more approaching it from more of a pragmatic, sort of way of, discussing the matter. And he introduces what he calls the groove of nature. So the idea with the groove of nature is that nature and nature, when we talk about sexual characteristics, primary and secondary sexual characteristics and so forth, these things are just simply real. As Christians, we talk about them as givens because we do believe that a God has given these things to us. But he's not using that language. He's just saying these are the grooves, and then gender is a way that a culture works in the grooves to help men and women relate to each other, for example, in a positive way.
Now, that's the original distinction that was made between sex and gender. Gender is what you get when sex intersects culture. Unfortunately, they've changed the definition. And this has happened with multiple different things. Definitions of racism have changed over time and so on. And they keep getting pushed in a more and more, ideological direction. So that gender is a social construct, by which they mean sex distinctions are really a social construct. They've collapsed the two into each other again, when the initial separation of sex and gender actually is kind of an interesting thing from the perspective of social sciences, another science that I'm not really sure about. But from looking at anthropology, looking at sociology, looking at history, that original distinction of what does it mean to be a man in a culture? What does it mean to be a woman in a culture? That's an interesting and valuable question to explore. But the way the trend has gone is, once again, gender, like I said, gender has collapsed back into sex, and it becomes something that doesn't perform a social function. It's purely psychological.
Yeah, I think that idea that it's purely psychological is where most people. One of the things that just astonishes me is that arguments for sort of the social benefits of kind of traditional family life are lost on people over the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, when I was younger, in the 80s and 90s, they still were salient. I mean, you could still say children need a father. You could still say things like, women bear children, and it's important for them to be united to the man who sired the child, stuff like that. Now that just is lost on people, even people in our churches, which is just astonishing to me, because people can't, they're unable to think. We've talked a little bit about functions and how we went from essences to functions, but we can't even talk about functions anymore. We've lost even that kind of language. So when you talk about just simply something as, I think, commonsensical as the examples I just enumerated, people kind of freak out, you know. Then you ask them, well, what do you propose? And they don't have any proposals. It's completely about the autonomy of the individual, you know, hell or high water, you know, come what may, who cares, or the government will pay for it, or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there is that. I mean, that's I think of Dave Bentley Hart's article, "Christ or Nothing," or "Christ and the Nothing," and that's his very point. I mean, and once Christianity kind of rid the world of all of the threat of non-gods, if you will, nihilism becomes the replacement. And that really is. What do I mean by nihilism here? I don't necessarily even mean any particular philosophy so much as this notion that the human choosing from nothing other than themselves, right? Whether you consider this as kind of spontaneous ex nihilo creation out of your own resources, it's not really ex nihilo, but that's the way they conceive it, or whether it's something that just picks in accord with who you think you are or what you feel you are. But there is nothing governing that choice. And so for them, what makes something good or bad, right or wrong, is the fact that we freely choose it, not whether or not there's some measure for it or some form it needs to correspond to. My students over, one of the Catholic schools I teach, bioethics, almost inevitable on their case studies, they will tend to pick one either on euthanasia or abortion. And at the end of the day, they all by default end up with the perspective. But human autonomy, they find that little note in there, the dignity of human autonomy, and they assume that trumps everything else. That person's say is all that should finally matter, not whether something is good or bad. And I constantly remind them that the whole point of the Christian moral tradition is to place a question mark over whether that choice in and of itself is enough. And I think there's no pushback in the church to that at all.
No, there's not. And,
and you see the same sort of thing in what passes for sexual ethics now. As long as it's consensual, it doesn't matter what you do. If it's consensual, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, so, Yenor does a good job of addressing the problems with that when it comes to consensual matters, because obviously people can have second thoughts, say, I didn't mean it back when I said yes, stuff like that. So it's not as firm a ground as people are assuming that it is. And where do the lines fall? There are lots of ways that in our society we don't give people the freedom to be the arbiters of reality, when it comes to just everyday matters like stopping at a stoplight, that kind of thing. The meaning of the stoplight is not, within the purview of the person behind the wheel of the car. In other words, its meaning, it just is. And now,
although some people in Connecticut think that it
but that's a good point, because that does introduce, I think, an important distinction between various kinds of limitations.
Yes.
I thought you were going to say it introduces an important distinction between Connecticut drivers and everybody else.
Well, maybe the breakdown of law is spreading, and because I saw some of this out in St. Louis just this past week. but there obviously are things. There are limitations that are instituted by human beings. There's positive law. So natural law and positive law are distinguished between the fact that positive law is law that we institute as human beings, and natural law is just simply the way things are. And now natural laws can be broken. It's not as though, because I think sometimes when people think of natural laws, they think of things that function like gravity. That's a natural law. But we're not talking about that kind of law of nature, right? We're talking about natural law in the sense that in order for a person to be truly happy, to live a life that is genuinely satisfying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there are certain things that have to be present. For example, other people.
Yeah.
That is part of the natural law, that you've got to interact in ways with other people that are mutually beneficial. If you don't, you're going to either be lonely or you're going to be miserable because other people are harming you. So that's an example of a natural law.
Well, interesting point there, because I think Yenor brings this up. I haven't read this whole. I do have this book. I haven't read it all yet. I did hear a lecture he gave, I think, at the American Mind. I listened to, and I think one of the things, I think it was him who was talking about, but he was talking also about the short-sightedness of this kind of feminist and lines, and of course the same with the left. This kind of disqualifying of one of the things that's a core aspect of human beings in families is the future, both
Right.
as community and for the individuals and for civilization and society. And so these huge things, different periods of time, had a much stronger conscious, awareness of, if you will, maybe not in every way, but at least, the next generation or the next couple of generations, and the investment of the present in that future versus the presentism of today, where the now is everything. And so you can do away with the past because you don't have a concern really for the next generation. What you're really worried about is the here and now, the getting everything here and now. And
Right.
and I think this is something.
I think that's one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the ironies of the ideology that sometimes is referred to as progressivism. It's really not about the future. It's about the present moment, kind of maximizing human autonomy in the present, even at the expense of the future. There are a number of ways that we are extracting the resources, and this sounds odd, but we're extracting the resources of the future to pay for our indulgence in the moment. I'm reminded of John Maynard Keynes, who's he was talking about Keynes when he's talking about his economic theories. Someone asked him, "What about the long run?" And he said, "We're all dead in the long run." In other words, let's just go for as much as we can get now and let the future take care of itself. And now there are some places where the forces of political correctness do recognize the importance of of preserving resources for future generations. I'm thinking in particular a lot of the talk surrounding the environment, for example. But when it comes to the social environment, these people are completely anarchists, it seems like.
Well, this is where that disconnection happens, and this is what I always said. I said, in general, one can see why a true conservative would be interested in conserving as well. But for someone who destroys pretty much the forest of the family and everything else, that is probably the most proportioned and balanced way of not harming the present moment in so many ways, even in terms of the environment. It is this bizarre relationship, and there again, I understand the motivation tends to be sinister and ideological, but I do probably think there are some out there who really do have a heart for nature and its sustenance. But they have made the connection between the lifestyles of the progressives, in the sense of that they have taken the kind of capitalist world and run wild with it, and yet now come and chasing everyone else for trying to kind of live within their means within it, as if anyone connected to it is all evil and bad. But there, we were talking about destroying complete places just for its exploitation and the like. So, you can see how they could measure, okay, lifestyle and environment impact are related, but they get the analysis completely out of sync and put the emphasis in the wrong places. And so, and I think we've all often said, I think doing a properly thick description, Christian understanding of the importance of the environment in relationship to the whole Christian vision is, I think, a task at hand.
Right.
And that's actually something that is worth paying attention to when we go to people like Tolkien.
Oh,
Who's very much concerned about those kinds of issues.
Yes.
Yes. I remember one time Russell Kirk was invited to a debate in which environmental regulations or whatever were going to be discussed, argued about, and he said, "Okay, what am I against?" And the person who had invited him to the debate said, "You're against the environment." In other words, so Kirk said, "I that's not what I'm going to defend. I'm not going to defend, the spoliation of the natural world." I think that one of the things that related to this particular matter is obviously we've got to take up space. We've got to make a place for ourselves in the world. And then the question of how do we do that in a way that is both, good for people and good for, the rest of the creation is a really good matter to think about and discuss. So, we've got people like Gordon Wilson, who's a friend of mine who wrote a book, A Different Shade of Green, and he's in that book discussing, biodiversity and its importance and why we need to be concerned about, what's happening to species and their extinction and stuff like that. So I think that's great. The trick is holding these things together, and I think you're right, Glenn. People like Tolkien, people like Russell Kirk, Rod Dreher. He wrote that book Crunchy Cons a number of years ago. I think that was like his first big book, and in that book he's trying to lay out a fully conservative way of life, that tends to these different matters. And sees their connections. But
another kind of example that we can look at is one that's sort of near and dear to my heart as a historian, and that's national debt. Great powers have always historically been sunk by out of control spending. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But I just did a quick calculation using the U.S. national debt clock. And if I crunched the numbers correctly, if we were to pay back the national debt at a rate of $1 per second, it would take us over 934,000 years.
Wow. Well, let's just hope that we can pay it back quicker than that.
Yeah. Well, but the fact of the matter is, we think that spending that kind of money for our current needs, ignoring the impact on future generations, we think somehow that this is a good idea.
Yeah, and we also are failing to create future generations.
Right.
That was the connection I was trying to.
Right.
Yeah.
Population is in decline all over the world, and so we're creating debt that's going to be crushing for a range of reasons, not just simply because it's so large, but also because the population is going to be smaller. So, that has to be taken into consideration. Now, the people who think that everything's just going to be fine, tell us that, we'll have robots and that, we won't need to worry about any of this stuff because, we'll be so much more productive in the future. But your point, I think, is well taken, Glenn. This is stuff that's happened before. This is not like and this is one of the things about the eradication of the past that is so troubling. People just simply do not know anything about. I mean, they don't even know, what life was like, when there was a Soviet Union. I mean, recent. You've got young people who have zero clue that there was such a thing as a Soviet Union, and we should have learned a lot of lessons about communism based on what people within that political order suffered. But it is the case that we live in a world that's just very present-oriented, not thinking about the past nor the future, and not thinking about the world as something that can inform how we go about living. And I'm talking about the natural world.
Yeah, the example of communism is interesting there because I think the current interest in socialism and communism and so on is really built around the idea that it's a kind of neo-Gnosticism again, from a bit of a different direction. It's built around the idea that our ideas about how things should work trump the reality of what does work. And it trumps history, it trumps experience, it trumps everything. This is just the way it should be. And so we're going to put it in place, even though it has failed uniformly every place it's been tried, because it violates nature, violates human nature.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this brings us to the part of the book that I'd like to spend the balance of our time talking about, and that's the way forward. So Yenor talks about so the problems with these different ideologies, helps to demonstrate how they conflict with each other, how they're full of internal inconsistencies, how they run up against reality and can't seem to learn anything in the process. So he's dealing with all of that, and then he gets to the point in the story or in the course of the books where he says, okay, well, what are we going to do now? And that's where we get the title, Recovery of Family Life. Now, the trouble is that if we are going to live within our limits, there's a very important institution that needs to do the work of encouraging living within limits in a limited way, and that's the government. In other words, it's not going to. We're not going to be saved by some dictator who comes around and just forces us to do the right thing. We need to have an approach to promoting life within limits in a limited way, and Yenor discusses how to do that by describing a way of government legislating through indirection or indirectly. So instead of the government saying, okay, like we see in China, you can't have this many kids, you can't have more than one or two or whatever the limit is today, or you got to do this or that, in terms of how you raise your kids. The government can encourage certain kinds of behaviors indirectly and discourage other kinds of behaviors indirectly. And it has to, unless we want to live in some kind of totalitarian scheme.
Yeah. I mean, you see again. You kind of can see this go in sinister directions, or you could see it in healthier directions. I mean, you can see certain things go up. Or get extra taxes because they want to kind of clamp down on certain things. Family travel, for example. Anything that Connecticut is constantly ushering in tax upon tax upon tax that crushes certain behaviors. So you want to slow down people from having larger families who can barely take 2 children on vacation. Keep putting a burden from every direction on them. Very indirectly, this is coming through a certain kind of tax here, a certain kind of toll here, and eventually it adds up to the point people can barely survive if they have more than a couple kids.
Right. Like I think that when we think about indirection, there's of course the approach that you've just described, which is awarding or punishing with taxation, certain kinds of behavior. So, in the United States, you have tax deductions, and your children are tax deductions. I'm at a stage of life where the kids are not around anymore, and so I can't take those tax.
Can't get those anymore.
Yeah, I'm like, I need kids back.
What's interesting is the language that they use. I haven't heard this recently, but a few years ago they were talking about the federal government subsidizing you through deductions.
Yeah, right.
So it isn't fair that people with children get a government subsidy.
Right.
Yeah. Now, the implication of that is that the money that you earn is the government's.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the hidden assumption there. But The language itself just demonstrates the hostility.
Yeah, and you saw it, with Obama and his sort of offhanded reference. You didn't build that. In other words, this is something that was created, by the government, and you just had the privilege of being a part of our grand whatever. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are other ways to encourage the good. Plato famously noted that what is honored in a country is practiced there. So when we think about what we honor, I deal with this a lot in marital counseling. I'm dealing with the whole matter of what our larger social environment honors and what God honors, and they're not the same things. So the larger social environment, particularly for women today, you are honored if you are very ambitious, if you pursue an education, if you become financially independent, and the costs in terms of fertility, getting married, long-term happiness. Well, too bad. That's not something. Those aren't things that are given much time or analysis. If you want those things, fine. That you're assured. Many women are assured you can have it all, but in fact, women often learn too late that they can't have it all. They have to make some either/or choices, and so we are seeing in our culture the results of what how women are honored. Women are honored for certain things, and that's why they're doing those things. And when it comes to men, there really is a kind of a litany of things that are dishonorable. There are these things that men are being discouraged from doing or being that are really out of accord with our natures. Just like when it comes to women are created by God to bear children. That's one of the things biologically, anatomically, that is just undeniable. Nevertheless, our friends in the academy would shriek at the very statement, but it's just simply
and it's just it's such a bizarre thing to shriek at.
Right.
I mean, really, you get that detached from reality to where you shriek at something that it's such an obvious given for the whole. I mean, not just human creatures.
Well, Tom, it's actually it's even worse than Chris is saying here. Because it's not just that they don't just object to the idea that one of the things that women are made for is bearing children. They object to the idea that bearing children is limited to women.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Yeah, we might see some uterus transplants here in the next few years, the way things are going.
But not in the elephant. Not in the elephant kingdom.
Well, this is an interesting, I guess, inconsistency. On the one hand, we're told that we are merely animals, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And if we were merely animals, then we behave entirely in ways that are consistent with other animals. In other words, there are no transgender elephants that I'm aware of. But that doesn't seem to carry over because, again, people think that. I think Gnostically that our spirits sort of hover over the waters and create form out of nothing. But
again, if you look at animals, what's the imperative that drives a lot of animal behavior? It's reproduction.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And this is where again, we get some curious bedfellows. Because when it comes to materialists, the people who make the best argument for kind of traditional values sometimes are the social Darwinists, the people who say, this is what men are for, this is what women are for, and if we don't kind of move in the grooves, the natural grooves, we're not going to have anybody to replace us someday. But anyway, I think you can see where I'm going with this. So I think that there's a kind of a when we think about why people do the things they do, yes, there is the reward that, is fiscal or monetary in nature, but there's also the fact that I think that we are honor-seeking creatures. We are people who want to do. This is what self-righteousness is all about. This is what a democracy has how it functions. People who tried to live honorably so they could be honored by their fellows. That's still a very strong social force in our world today. People doing things for approval, and when I talk to young women, when I talk to young men, they have a very difficult time reconciling these two things. What they really kind of want at a deep level, and what the society is encouraging them to do or not do. And that's a whole other matter. And this is one of the things, of course, that Roger gets into in his book, The Benedict Option, when he talks about the need for, communities that can provide the environments within which, people can live Christianly in the world. Anyway, I'm getting to the point where we should wrap things up. We've gone, I think, probably about as long as we should. But anything you guys want to say as we wrap up?
One last point on what you just said. I think it's very interesting. You mentioned the fact that we kind of have this kind of desire as human creatures oftentimes to be honored or to push things, to transcend the limits of our circumstances in some way. And I think what this does is it gives us a glimpse into the broken image of God that needs restoration and redemption. That is, we are made to be sons and daughters of God. And so even in everything else we are as human creatures and being husbands and wives, having children, sustaining that life, and then pushing culture and society, all these things are tied in a way towards this, becoming glorified eventually in union with the triune God. But for Christianity, they're not. They don't have to work or be split apart. They don't have to work apart or be split apart. That you can be working towards the honorable and the good and the beautiful and glorification, all the while carrying out that beautiful gift of relationships, form, and order that we were created to indwell, and without having to run and make an idol out of being honored in some way that you have to basically chase honor and throw your family under the bus, right? So I think these things can be held together in the right proportion, without having to go to the extremes that have done serious damage to the world.
Right. Anything you want to say, Glenn?
Yeah, I'm looking at this just in terms of attitudes toward time. The overwhelming focus on what's good for me right now, the destruction of the past, the complete lack of concern of what this will mean for future generations unless it's rhetorically useful. What I'm struck by there is that when you compare this to Christianity, and I'm using that in the broadest sense of the word, you do have Jesus saying, "Don't worry about tomorrow because tomorrow will take care of itself." On the other hand, a lot of the New Testament is really put in terms, and actually Old Testament as well, in terms of future hope. Now, that gets distorted in certain forms of premillennial eschatology that says basically it doesn't matter, the world's all going to burn anyway. The same people who do that, by the way, also destroy the past. They completely ignore church history and everything else. The only thing that they're interested in typically is the Bible, and frequently mostly the New Testament, not much of the Old Testament.
And usually just a few doctrines related to rapture and stuff like that.
And what I'm struck by is, although it's in a totally different context and has totally different implications, the connection between the overwhelmingly presentist bias of the culture and that particular subsection of evangelicalism, they really share an attitude toward time and culture that's remarkably similar, even though they go in totally different directions politically.
Yeah, I think that's really a great observation, Glenn. I think one of the things that maybe we should use as a divining rod in terms of getting off track is is that sort of thing. Is this particular theological development too comfortable with certain destructive sort of trends within our larger culture? That's I think something that happens at all levels of sophistication and class life and stuff like that. I particularly think that a lot of this stuff finds a home in upper middle class and upper class churches with regard to the LGBTQ stuff. They're very much very much those folks are working really hard to kind of accommodate or make Christianity fit into these modern trends. But anyway, we've talked a lot. we should probably wrap it up. We really do appreciate you listening to the Theology Pugcast. By the way, I'm going to be getting on a jet plane on Monday to fly back to Connecticut, and we're going to be doing a number of live shows back there, and we probably we'll get together at least 2 times, maybe more. And what we'll do is when we know what we're doing and where we're meeting and so forth, we'll put the information up on the Facebook page for the podcast, and also maybe the Grumblers. Those are the 2 places where folks who listen to the show seem to hang out. And if you're in the area, if you're in Central Connecticut and would like to be, in the live audience and join us for that and enjoy some beer with us and some food, that'd be great. By the way, I saw that Artisanal Burger, where we have recorded the show in the past, was rated the #1 burger place in Connecticut. That very restaurant that we were in. So anyway, so you can get a great burger there. But that's enough for now. Thanks again, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.